The candlelight in Dumbledore's study flickered as if some unseen wind had crept through Hogwarts. Though every window was sealed and the stone walls were thick enough to mute even the howl of winter, he stood alone at the centre of a vast circle of runes, ancient, intricate, and trembling with gathering power. Books lay open around him, some whispering in languages older than Britain's birth, others resisting being read at all. He ignored the tremors of the floor, the groans drifting through the walls, and the faint crackling in the air. His focus was unbroken, carved from decades of mastery and sorrow. Tonight, he would attempt the impossible. Tonight, he would open a path into the truth behind magic itself. The spell he prepared was not meant for mortal hands. It had been traced through the margins of forgotten manuscripts, pieced together from fragments gathered across continents, and contemplated for half a lifetime. He had never shared its existence. Even Grindelwald, in their youth, had not glimpsed these particular secrets. This was Dumbledore's burden alone, a quest born from guilt, from visions of futures he feared, and from the knowledge that the fabric of magic was straining in ways wizards could not see. As he raised the Elder Wand, its core humming with a sonorous depth, he murmured the first incantation. The air tightened. The runes ignited. A low throb shook the study, rattling the portraits on the walls. Some of the painted figures woke and cried warnings. Others fled from their frames entirely, but he heard none of them. The world narrowed to wand, breath, and will. Light blossomed from the floor. Not the gentle glow of spellcraft, but a raw, blinding radiance, as though the universe itself had been pierced. Dumbledore's heartbeat thundered in his chest, synced to the pulse of the runic circle. He felt the tether of his magic extending, threading beyond Hogwarts, beyond the sky, reaching into a place that was not a place. For a moment, he glimpsed an ocean made of thought and storm, a realm with no horizon, where colours screamed and shadows bent unnaturally. The sight pressed against his mind like a weight, but he did not recoil. He strengthened the anchor of the spell, binding himself with a whisper of the Elder Wand's authority. The veil thinned. Time wavered. The floor beneath him cracked. But still he held on, weaving the strands, commanding the forces that sought to slip free. He sensed the presence of something immeasurably vast watching him from the other side. An intellect made of mist and nightmare. Its curiosity curled around him, cold and ancient. He had expected resistance. He had not expected awareness. The study began to distort as the veil frayed. Walls swam like reflections on water. Gravity trembled. Dust rose in slow spirals. He felt both grounded and untethered. His senses stretched into the breach he had opened. He understood now why the texts had warned that only those willing to sacrifice themselves might survive such magic. But the risk had always been his to bear. The alternative, the slow corrosion of the world he protected, was unacceptable. With a final surge of will, he forced the spell to completion. The veil shattered. Not like glass, not like parchment, but like the collapse of a notion, an unravelling of the boundary between the material and the unimaginable. A violent shockwave tore through the room. Books flew like startled birds. Stone fractured. The Elder Wand screamed with energy. Dumbledore felt himself seized by forces beyond all earthly understanding. It was not a pull nor a fall, but something stranger, a rearrangement of existence, as though his body was being rewritten, his mind turned inside out. Everything he had ever been, headmaster, mentor, warrior, seeker, was peeled away layer by layer. He glimpsed memories erupting into the void, young Tom Riddle's hungry eyes, Ariana's trembling hands, forks bursting into flame, the great hall filled with candlelight. They dissolved into rivers of fire and shadow. The world of Hogwarts shrank until it was a pinprick swallowed by a sea of impossible colour. He drifted through the Imperium. The warp howled around him, a storm of consciousnesses locked in eternal fury. Voices clawed at his thoughts, whispering temptations, threats, and lies. Shapes twisted in the distance. Colossal silhouettes with wings of broken reality, swirling vortexes of faces, titanic forms that pulsed like dying stars. Emotions that were not his own surged within him. Hatred, ecstasy, terror, hunger. Yet he did not break. He clung to his identity with a serenity forged through trials no less grim than what now surrounded him. His mind became a lighthouse in the infinite storm, casting out a clarity the warp had not known in millennia. The chaos energies recoiled, curious and cautious. A ripple moved through the storm. Something was watching, or perhaps many things. Great lords of the Imperium whose attention tore at the edges of thought. Their curiosity pressed against him like talons made of intention. They probed, they tested, they whispered his name without sound. Albus Dumbledore, a mortal soul of unusual light, an anomaly within their dominion. He felt the pressure constrict, as if the warp itself were deciding whether to consume him or reshape him. Spells flickered at his fingertips, instinctive defenses woven from the deepest wells of his power. The Elder Wand glowed like a fragment of a dying star. In the distance, a tear in the storm opened, a wound in the Imperium through which real space flickered like a memory. If he crossed it, he sensed everything would change. If he failed, he would be nothing but another echo lost in the warp. The storm recoiled as he approached the breach, its winds bending around him with unnatural interest. He felt something reaching, some intelligence made of schemes and shifting fates, as if inviting him deeper. But he did not accept. With a final surge of will, he forced himself through the rift. Light devoured him, heat seared him, and as he fell toward a world he had never seen, the last thing he heard was a whisper threading through the dying storm. "Welcome, magician. The Imperium has been waiting." The ground rushed up to meet him, and the warp closed behind him like an eye shutting. The next moment shattered everything he thought he understood. He did not land so much as awaken, lying upon scorched earth beneath a sky that churned like a cauldron of bruised clouds. The impact that should have shattered bones left him only breathless, his robes smouldering and the Elder Wand warm in his grip. The world around him groaned with distant artillery, the metallic tang of ozone, and the thick scent of burning incense drifting from ruins that dotted the bleak horizon. Dumbledore rose slowly, steadying himself as the memory of the warp storm still throbbed in his thoughts, its whispers fading like echoes from a nightmare that refused entirely to leave. He surveyed the landscape. Black sand hissed under winds that carried ash from unseen fires. Towering spires lay broken, their architecture strange, yet reminiscent of a Gothic cathedral stretched into impossible proportions. Statues of armored saints stood decapitated, their stone bodies cracked and half consumed by corrosion. This place bore the scars of a world used to suffering, a world where the sky itself seemed burdened by sorrow. He tightened his grip on the wand, sensing lingering warp traces, faint but unmistakably malignant, wafting like unseen smoke across the desolate plain. A cry pierced the distant wind, not the roar of war, not the howl of beasts, but a human cry of pain. Instinct propelled him forward. His boots crushed charred fragments of shattered relics as he approached a crumbled wall where a figure lay pinned beneath broken masonry. It was a young soldier, clad in drab armor stained by blood and dust. His eyes widened in terror at the sight of the robed stranger approaching. "Stay back," the man rasped, struggling to lift a weapon far too heavy for his weakened hands. "Witchcraft. Mutant." His voice broke. He coughed blood. Dumbledore knelt without hesitation, ignoring the weapon trembling in the soldier's grasp. With a gentle flick of his wand, the rubble lifted as if weightless and drifted aside. The soldier stared, wide-eyed, unable to comprehend what he had seen. "Easy now," Dumbledore murmured, his tone calm, the same he once used for frightened children in the halls of Hogwarts. "You are hurt, but not beyond help." A soft blue glow emanated from the wand's tip, knitting broken bone and sealing torn flesh. The young man gasped as warmth flooded through him, driving out the chill of shock. You are no psycho I've ever seen," the soldier whispered, awe and confusion mingling. "Your power, it feels clean." "I am not familiar with your word," Dumbledore replied, gently, "but I assure you, I mean you no harm." The air trembled with another distant blast. Smoke rose from beyond the ruined ridge, accompanied by harsh metallic chanting carried on the wind. The soldier's face drained of colour. "They're coming," he whispered. "The cultists. They took the shrine. They slaughtered the priesthood. If they find us—" A new sound broke through the wind. Many footsteps, erratic and chaotic, accompanied by frenzied screams that grew ever closer. Dumbledore helped the soldier to his feet and guided him behind the broken wall. The young man's breathing quickened as shadows appeared through the smoke. Twisted figures carrying rusted blades and ritual symbols carved crudely into their flesh. Their eyes glowed with febrile madness. Dumbledore rose to meet them. The cultists halted at the sight of him, their expressions twisting with equal parts fury and confusion. One stepped forward, a hulking brute whose skin was tattooed with spirals of crimson. His voice gurgled with unnatural distortion. "A soul fallen from the storm," the brute croaked, "a gift carried to us by the architect's will." They charged. Dumbledore did not retreat. The Elder Wand moved in a sweeping arc, and a wave of shimmering force rippled outward. The first attackers were thrown back as if struck by an invisible hammer, bodies tumbling across the dirt. The next wave met a blaze of silver fire that erupted from the wand's tip, purging the corrupted flesh with a brilliance that seemed alien to this world. The storm of blades and screams dissolved beneath a storm of light. The soldier stared in disbelief. By the throne. But the cultists did not break. Enraged screams rose again as more figures emerged from the haze, dozens, then scores, their chants rising in a discordant crescendo. Dumbledore's expression hardened, a quiet resolve settling over him. He raised his wand and cast a barrier of shimmering light around the soldier, anchoring it firmly into the ground. "Stay within this," he instructed softly, "no matter what happens." The cultists surged like a tide. Magic met madness. Bolts of twisted psychic energy streaked from some of the warped figures, crackling with dissonance. Dumbledore countered with controlled precision, each motion of the Elder Wand a stroke of mastery. He deflected the psychic blasts with conjured shields that rang like struck glass. He summoned chains of conjured lightning that wrapped around the cultists' limbs and dragged them to the earth. He transfigured rubble into barriers that rose from the ground like stone titans. Yet for every foe that fell, more poured forward. This world, he realized, had no shortage of horror. A psychic scream pierced his mind. For a heartbeat, he felt the same cold presence he had sensed in the warp. curious, probing, whispering from behind the curtain of the world. The sensation was faint but unmistakable. Something watched. The cultists hesitated suddenly, their frenzy faltering. The ground trembled beneath their feet. From beyond the ridge came a sound like the grinding of armored treads and the bark of disciplined voices. The soldier gasped with relief. "The guard! The regiment is returning!" Dumbledore lowered his wand slightly as tanks rolled into view, their hulls scarred but intact, their turrets swinging down upon the cultists. Lass fire cut through the smoke in crimson lines. The cultists broke and scattered, retreating into the shattered ruins. The soldiers who emerged from behind the tanks stared at Dumbledore in stunned silence. Some raised their weapons. Others whispered prayers. All eyes remained fixed upon the old wizard standing alone amid scorched earth and fallen foes. The young man he had healed stepped forward shakily. "He saved my life," he said, "and the Emperor's light was with him." Dumbledore said nothing. The wind carried the scent of ash and incense, the faint taste of the warp lingering in the air like an omen. He knew the world he had entered was one of judgment and fear, where mercy was rare and suspicion ever present. The officer approached cautiously, his gaze sharp. "Stranger," he said, "identify yourself. No psyker does what you just did." Dumbledore met his stare with quiet calm. "My name," he answered, "is Albus Dumbledore, and it seems I have much to learn about your world." Above them, thunder rumbled across the dying sky, and the warp's whispers curled faintly at the edge of hearing, as if amused by what would come next. The soldiers formed a wary half-circle around Dumbledore as the dust settled, their laser guns trained on him with a discipline born from a lifetime of fear and obedience. The officer, a scarred man with a stern expression, etched deep by war, motioned for two troopers to search the ruins for any remaining threats. Dumbledore sensed the tension surrounding him as clearly as he sensed the lingering warp taint drifting through the broken air. These men had survived battles that left no room for trust, and every unknown was a potential demon waiting to reveal its true shape. Yet the old wizard stood calm, letting the silence shape the moment. The officer stepped forward again, his voice carrying the iron edge of command. "You wield power unlike any sanctioned psyker of the Imperium. This world has seen too much sorcery of the wrong kind. You will come with us, for your sake and ours." Dumbledore nodded, offering no resistance. He understood well the instinct to protect, even when it meant harsh measures. As he followed the regiment toward their armored convoy, he studied the terrain more closely. The ground bore the scars of endless shelling, the once sacred structures now skeletal remains jutting from the earth like broken ribs. Banners depicting a golden figure radiating holy fire lay trampled and half buried in ash. The sky pulsed with a sickly glow, as though the firmament itself groaned under spiritual corrosion. The young soldier he had saved, now walking with steadier steps, glanced at him with a mixture of gratitude and unease. "Sir," he murmured to the officer, "the stranger healed me. I felt no corruption in his touch." "Warp trickery often feels pleasant before it devours you," the officer replied, without looking back. "Stay vigilant." Dumbledore sensed the young man's shame at the reprimand. He placed a gentle hand on the soldier's shoulder. "You have nothing to apologize for. Truth is seldom welcomed easily." The young man managed a faint nod before hurrying ahead. Moments later, they reached the heart of what remained of the Imperial encampment. Tents burned in smouldering heaps. Wounded soldiers sat in rows, their expressions blank as medics worked tirelessly. The stench of blood and promethium clung to the air. A shattered statue of a robed saint leaned against a crater, its stone face eroded by fire. Dumbledore felt a weight settle over him. The quiet despair of a world fighting extinction. He was led through the camp toward a towering structure that loomed like a blackened monolith. Once, it had likely been a cathedral, its spires reaching for the heavens in devotion. Now only one remained upright, cracked and scorched. Its vast doors hung open, revealing a dim interior lit by flickering votive flames. "This is St. Corvin's Basilica," the officer said. "We hold what ground we can, but the cults are spreading faster than we can burn them out. If you are truly no servant of the warp, perhaps the Inquisition will spare your life." The name carried a sharpness that gave even hardened soldiers pause. Dumbledore sensed the collective unease. The Inquisition held the authority to condemn worlds or absolve them, wielding fear like a blade. But he merely inclined his head and stepped inside the cathedral. The interior swallowed sound. Rows of shattered pews lay broken, the altar scorched black by ritual fire. Stained glass windows depicting saints and martyrs had been blasted apart. Brilliant fragments scattered across the floor. A single banner hung above the altar, depicting a golden figure on a throne of light. Dumbledore felt eyes watching him, though he knew they were only from the portraits of canonized warriors that miraculously survived the devastation. The officer gestured toward a circle of robed priests tending to wounded guards beside the altar. Their chanting was low and rhythmic, a plea for protection. One of them turned, his face etched with lines of exhaustion and reverent suspicion. "You bring a sorcerer into the house of the Emperor?" the priest asked sharply. "Have you lost reason?" "He may be useful," the officer replied, "and the Inquisitor will judge him soon enough." The priest's gaze locked onto Dumbledore, searching his eyes for corruption. Dumbledore simply bowed his head respectfully. "Your world suffers greatly," he said softly. "If I can aid you, I will." There was a fragile moment in which the priest hesitated, his duty warring with his instinct. At last, he nodded. "If you speak truth, then perhaps the Emperor has willed your arrival." But the uncertainty in his tone revealed his fear that this was only wishful thinking. A sudden tremor shook the cathedral, dust drifting from the cracked ceiling. The officer tensed. "Another bombardment?" "No," whispered one of the priests, his voice trembling. "Something stirs beneath the shrine." Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly, extending his senses. Beneath the ruined cathedral, a faint pulse emanated, warp-born, rhythmic, and growing stronger. The same cold intelligence he had felt in the Imperium brushed against his consciousness, as though it tested the boundaries of his mind. He opened his eyes sharply. "There is corruption beneath us," he warned. "It grows." The officer drew his sidearm. "Impossible. The vaults are sealed." The floor shuddered again, harder this time, and from the depths below came a sound like 1,000 whispering voices merging into one. Cracks spidered across the stone tiles. The votive candles flickered violently. The priest fell silent. Fear swelled like a suffocating fog. Without waiting for command, Dumbledore strode toward the altar, raising his wand. Blue light shimmered along its length. The cathedral grew still for a heartbeat, all eyes on him as ancient stone groaned beneath their feet. Another tremor struck, this one violent enough to topple a shattered pew. Then the voice from below rose louder, a guttural chant echoing through the stones. The very air thickened with warp energy, curling around the cathedral like spectral smoke. The officer shouted for his men to form ranks. Priests lifted their relic blades and holy symbols, praying through clenched teeth. Dumbledore stood at the edge of the altar steps, his gaze fixed upon the cracking floor. The warp presence intensified, a malign intelligence coiling upward, hungry and aware. He tightened his grip on the Elder Wand. Something was coming, and it had sensed him first. The cracking beneath the cathedral floor deepened into a fissure, splitting the stone with a violent snap that echoed through the vaulted chamber like the report of a cannon. Dust poured from the ceiling in pale streams. Priests stumbled back, clutching their relics as though the Emperor's symbols alone could halt what was rising. The officer barked orders, but even his voice wavered as an icy wind surged upward through the widening rift. It carried with it the stench of decay and something far worse, the unmistakable taint of the warp. Dumbledore stepped down from the altar steps, moving with unhurried precision despite the chaos around him. He extended the Elder Wand, and the air around him thrummed with mounting energy. The young soldier he had saved earlier looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, yet he held his ground, as if the wizard's calm anchored him. The officers and guardsmen formed a loose perimeter, their weapons trained on the fracture. They feared him, but they feared what lay beneath far more. The rift ruptured with a thunderous roar. Warp light spilled upward in a violent column, swirling with unnatural colors that belonged to no earthly spectrum. From within that bloom of corrupted brilliance, shapes clawed into view, warped forms of flesh and shadow. Cultists emerged first, gaunt figures whose bodies bore twisting runes carved deep into their skin. Their mouths moved in a single, unified chant that vibrated against the bones of every living soul present. Behind them, a far larger silhouette pushed against the edges of the breach, as though struggling to birth itself into the physical world. Priests fell to their knees, some praying, others trembling so violently they dropped their icons. Dumbledore raised his voice, not in fear, but with command. "All of you, stand clear." A wave of psychic pressure burst from the rift, knocking several guards off their feet. The officer staggered, bracing himself on the remnants of a shattered pew. "Emperor, preserve us," he murmured, his eyes glued to the swelling shadow rising from the vortex. It emerged with a heaving, grotesque grace, a monstrous creature formed from tendrils of warp matter and jagged limbs that writhed like serpents. Its eyes glowed with sickly blue fire, and its mouth, if the grotesque fissure could be called that, writhed with whispers that slithered directly into the mind. A demon, one birthed from the very madness Dumbledore had glimpsed in the Imperium. The cultists surged forward at its appearance, emboldened by the horror they had summoned. Their voices climbed in frenzied worship as they pointed toward the wizard standing alone before them. "Behold the offering," one cried, "the storm-fallen soul for the architect of fate." Dumbledore's expression hardened. The Elder Wand pulsed once, bright enough to illuminate the fractured mosaic beneath his feet. He took a single step toward the demon. "I have seen enough of your madness." The creature lunged, its limbs cutting through the air with soundless speed. The impact would have torn a lesser being apart, but Dumbledore moved with a fluid precision born of decades facing darkness in many forms. His wand arced, drawing a sigil of pure light, and a shimmering shield materialized just as the demon's limb struck. The blow exploded against the barrier in a shower of sparks, the force resonating through the cathedral walls. Guardsmen who had braced themselves were thrown backward by the shockwave. The priest nearest him cried out as the holy candles flickered violently. Dumbledore did not falter. With a twist of his wrist, the barrier transformed into a surge of spellfire that blasted the demon back into the air. The warp light recoiled as though in pain, rippling across the creature's malformed body. Yet it recovered quickly, shrieking with rising fury. His voice wormed through the minds of those present, igniting visions of despair, twisted futures, and broken fates. Even the strongest guardsman blinked away tears of terror. The old wizard's voice cut through the psychic assault. No. The single word radiated authority. His magic flared, a blazing aura encircling him in pale blue luminescence. He drew upon the deepest reservoirs of power, magic nurtured through wisdom, empathy, sacrifice, and unyielding will. The demon leapt again, and the cultist charged beside it. Dumbledore met them with the first true spell of defiance he had cast upon this world. A comet of white flame erupted from his wand, sweeping forward in a great arc. Where it passed, the warp taint shriveled and recoiled. Cultists disintegrated into drifting ash, their screams swallowed by the roar of spellfire. The demon struck the ground, its flesh blistering beneath the cleansing column of light. It writhed, convulsing, its screams warping the air in waves of distortion. Still, it fought to rise. Dumbledore advanced. The wizard's steps echoed with calm purpose as he approached the thrashing monstrosity. His robes fluttered in the rising wind of its psychic backlash, but he did not diminish. He knew what the creature was, an extension of the intelligence he had sensed watching from the warp, a puppet woven from chaos itself. He lifted the Elder Wand, its glow crescendoing. "You will bring no further suffering," he said softly. A vortex of golden blue fire shot forth, engulfing the demon entirely. The cathedral trembled under the force of the spell. Priests shielded their faces. Guardsmen crouched behind fragments of broken pillars, and the officer stared in disbelief as the demonic form dissolved into motes of nothingness, ripped apart by the purity of magic that chaos had never encountered. The rift beneath the cathedral convulsed once more. Warp light screamed upward, then imploded in a crack like lightning splitting the sky. The fissure sealed with a thunderous boom, leaving only scorched stone where corruption had risen moments before. Silence swept through the cathedral. The guardsmen lowered their weapons slowly. The priests stared with trembling awe. The officer approached, his voice roughened by shock. "You sealed a warp breach," he whispered, "with sorcery that did not corrupt, with power I cannot comprehend." Dumbledore lowered his wand, the glow fading. His breathing was steady, but there was weariness behind his eyes. The cost of channeling such vast magic in a realm where the Imperium prowled like a predator. "I did what was necessary," he said quietly. The officer hesitated, then spoke with grim certainty. The Inquisition must hear of this immediately. A shadow passed over the cathedral windows, as though something massive had moved across the dying sky. Dumbledore sensed it, a presence approaching, not cultist, not demon, something far more dangerous. Someone had noticed his defiance. The shadow that drifted across the ruined cathedral windows lingered like a silent omen, stretching its presence over the soldiers and priests who remained frozen after the collapse of the warp breach. Dumbledore felt the shift in the air before anyone spoke, an intensity in the atmosphere that did not belong to fear or awe, but to authority honed through centuries of merciless purpose. The officer stiffened, his jaw tightening as he turned toward the cathedral entrance. His voice dropped to a haunted whisper. "They're here." Boots clattered on the stone outside, measured, disciplined, the sound of individuals who feared no earthly threat. Priests exchanged terrified glances. Even the guardsmen, hardened by war and near death, straightened into rigid posture. Only Dumbledore stood unmoved, though he felt the weight of the approaching presence as one might feel the first breath of a winter storm. The great doors of the cathedral creaked open, protesting on war-rusted hinges. A gust of cold air swept through the hall, scattering ash across the shattered floor. 3 figures entered, flanked by soldiers in black armor whose pauldrons bore the sigil of a burning eye, a brand of authority feared across the Imperium. Their helms hid their faces, but their weapons remained unwaveringly trained on the center of the room. Between them walked a woman draped in dark robes finely embroidered with silver inquisitorial markings. Her gaze moved like a blade, and her presence pressed against the air with the force of a storm held barely at bay. She was not imposing by stature, but something within her aura radiated the cold, cutting certainty of one who had judged worlds and ended them. Dumbledore met her gaze without bowing, though he felt the iron scrutiny behind it. The officer stepped forward, saluting with a stiffness that bordered on dread. "Inquisitor Callistra, we did not expect your arrival so soon." "We received your distress call," she said, her tone calm yet serrated. "A warp breach within a basilica cannot wait upon distance." She stepped further into the hall, boots echoing across the cracked mosaic. Her eyes swept over the bodies of ash, the scorched stones, and finally the sealed fissure that still radiated faint warmth. She paused. "This destruction was not wrought by your regiment." "No, Inquisitor," the officer admitted, his voice tight. "It was him." Her gaze snapped toward Dumbledore with predatory precision. She approached slowly, each step deliberate, as though measuring the space between them in increments of threat. The guards accompanying her shifted subtly, adjusting their weapons' aim toward the wizard. Dumbledore sensed not maliciousness, but the precise readiness of those trained to kill without hesitation. The old wizard gave a faint nod of respect. "Inquisitor," he greeted with steady composure. Her voice held none in return. "Identify your allegiance." "I have none in your realm," Dumbledore replied. "I come from another world entirely, one beyond your wars and beyond the warp." Her eyes narrowed. "All psychers name their powers differently when death approaches." She circled him once, slowly. "Your manifestations are unlike sanctioned methods. Your aura does not resonate with the taint of the Imperium, yet your capabilities exceed even the most potent human psychers." She stopped in front of him, staring directly into his eyes. "Explain how you sealed a warp breach alone." "I use my own magic," he said. "Not that of your warp, but a force." He paused, considering how best to phrase a concept alien to this world. Rooted not in corruption, but in will, knowledge, and harmony with the deeper nature of reality. The Inquisitor's expression did not soften. If anything, the unflinching serenity in his answer seemed to intensify her suspicion. "Magic is a childish word," she said coldly. "Words often carry their worlds within them," Dumbledore replied. "Your own speaks through the terms you hold sacred." The guards surrounding her tensed, but she raised a single gloved hand, halting their movement. Her attention remained locked on him, searching for cracks in his resolve, for tremors of deception or warp influence. She found none. Instead, she found something that unsettled her more: calm. The Inquisitor moved closer until she stood mere inches from him, her tone dangerously soft. "Understand this, outsider. If you are touched by chaos, even lightly, I will purge you without hesitation." Dumbledore inclined his head slightly. "A fair warning." Her gaze flickered briefly, confusion, annoyance, before she stepped back. She paced slowly toward the collapsed altar, examining the scorched stone where the demon had been obliterated. "You fought the creature," she said. Not with warp sorcery, but something else. She traced a gloved finger along a blackened crack in the floor. It recoiled from your power. I did what your people could not, Dumbledore answered, his voice gentle rather than proud. I simply protected the innocent. Many claim purity while hiding corruption, she said sharply. And many wield suspicion to justify cruelty, he replied softly, meeting her gaze once more. The tension in the hall tightened like a drawn bowstring. Even the candles seemed to lower their flames. The Inquisitor spoke again, more carefully now. Regardless of your origin, your presence here is an anomaly. The warp does not give without taking. You will come with me for evaluation, perhaps interrogation. Her tone made the word feel as cold as steel. Your fate will be decided once your nature is fully understood. The guards lifted their weapons again. The implication was unmistakable. Dumbledore lifted his wand, not aggressively, but with slow, dignified clarity. The guards braced, ready to fire. Lumiance flickered along the Elder Wand's length, but then Dumbledore lowered it to his side, signaling calm. I will not raise my hand unless forced, he said quietly. Your world is unfamiliar to me, but I seek no conflict. His words left a quiet resonance in the cathedral, the kind that made even the most hardened soldiers question whether they had judged too quickly. The Inquisitor studied him a moment longer, then nodded once. Wise. A distant rumble rolled across the valley outside, deeper and more sustained than thunder. The cathedral's stained window remnants quivered. A communication officer rushed into the hall, helmet dented and breath frantic. Inquisitor, another Chaos host is mobilizing. Thousands. They march for St. Corvin's Gate. The temperature in the cathedral seemed to fall. The officer looked toward Dumbledore with conflicted dread. The Inquisitor turned to him with cold certainty. You will come with us, she said, but before judgment, you will fight. Outside, the war drums of chaos began to beat. The war drums outside grew louder, a steady, brutal cadence that vibrated through the cathedral's fractured pillars. The Inquisitor shifted her stance, calculating the pace of the approaching horde by the rhythm of each distant thud. Dumbledore felt it as well, the encroaching pressure of the warp gathering behind the enemy, swelling like a malignant tide. Yet inside the cathedral, time seemed to pause as the Inquisitor gestured sharply for the guards to seal the doors. The last rays of the dying sun dimmed behind slabs of stone as massive barricades slid into place. Within the sudden hush, she turned back to Dumbledore. We will not waste the time we have, she said. You will speak, and I will judge the truth in your words. Her voice held the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering verdicts before questions. Dumbledore offered a small nod, neither submissive nor defiant. Very well. The officer and several priests gathered near the ruined altar, forming a half-circle around the wizard. Their faces held a mixture of reverence and suspicion. The young soldier stood near the edge of the group, his posture straight despite lingering pain, drawn forward by a sense of duty and hope he could not hide. The Inquisitor folded her arms. You say you are not a psyker. You claim to come from another realm entirely. Prove it is not the delusion of a corrupted mind. Dumbledore paused for a moment, considering the weight of the question. Then he lifted the Elder Wand, not to cast, but to show its form. Its ancient wood shimmered faintly, its core pulsing with a restrained gentle power. In my world, he began, this wand is an extension of my will. It channels magic born not of the warp, but of the essence that shapes all things. Choice, intention, harmony. It is not a spark stolen from entities of chaos, nor a fragment of psychic mutation. It is a craft rooted in understanding. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. Words are wind. Then look deeper, Dumbledore replied. He held the wand forward, open-handed, letting its power radiate gently into the space. It was not a forceful surge, but a warmth, subtle, stabilizing, pushing back the warp's lingering residue like a lantern held against encroaching night. The priests inhaled sharply. Even the shadows shifted, retreating by a fraction. The Inquisitor stepped closer, her gaze fixed, unblinking. She reached out, not touching the wand, but hovering her gloved hand near it, testing the air. There was no backlash of screaming psychic noise, no clawing tendrils of madness, only a deep, steady hum, like a heartbeat strengthened by centuries of discipline and compassion. This is... She stopped herself, refusing to finish the thought. Dumbledore offered a quiet smile. Something different. Before she could retract her hand, a faint tremor rolled through the cathedral. A gust of corrupted wind rattled the stained glass fragments, extinguishing half the candles. A tinge of warp energy seeped through the cracks in the stone, as though chaos itself probed for weaknesses in their sanctuary. The Inquisitor's eyes snapped to the priests. Reinforce the warding lines. Now. They obeyed instantly, chanting litanies and placing small relics along the walls. Yet even as they worked, Dumbledore sensed the growing dread beneath their efforts. The wards were faltering. Chaos pressed too strongly. The officer turned to him. If the cults breach the gate before we can evacuate the civilians, the planet falls. We cannot hold them alone. Dumbledore absorbed his words with quiet heaviness. He saw exhaustion etched in every face. These men and women were fighting not merely an army, but despair itself. He folded his hands calmly. I will help you defend this world, he said, but I must understand it. If I am to stand beside you, I must know what gives meaning to your struggle. The Inquisitor motioned sharply to the officer and priest. He wants answers. He shall have them. Speak. A priest stepped forward, his voice trembling but earnest. This world, revered by millions, holds a relic shrine of St. Corvin. His sacrifice once drove back a legion of heretics. Chaos seeks to defile his memory, to twist faith into despair. Another priest continued. The warp storms worsened after your arrival. We feared corruption, but the breach you sealed proves your power does not strengthen chaos. Dumbledore listened closely, frowning slightly. Something followed me from the Imperium, something curious. The Inquisitor's expression hardened. Then we must learn what it wants. She turned fully to him now, no longer interrogator and suspect, but two minds assessing a battlefield too vast for either alone. What did you sense in the warp? She asked. A presence, Dumbledore said softly. Watching, testing. It followed my passage from that realm to this one. It seeks influence, control, perhaps understanding. His gaze darkened. Its hunger reminded me of a young wizard I once knew, gifted yet consumed by ambition. The Inquisitor stepped closer. Zinj. The name carried the weight of a curse. The changer of ways, she said. Architect of fate. Among the mightiest of the ruinous powers. If he noticed you. Her voice diminished into a cold whisper. We tread upon cracking ice. The officer clenched his jaw. If chaos has marked him, we cannot trust. Trust is earned, Dumbledore interjected gently. I do not expect it freely. He lifted his wand, letting faint sparks drift from its tip. But I offer what power I can to defend your people. The Inquisitor studied him in silence. Outside, the war drums shifted tempo, the unmistakable sound of ranks forming, preparing to advance. The cathedral trembled again, dust falling like snow. The young soldier gripped his rifle tightly. The Inquisitor spoke at last, her tone no longer cold but resolute. "Then hear this. If you fight with us, you will answer to me. I will judge your intentions, your actions, and the nature of your power. If you falter, if corruption touches you, I will end you myself." Dumbledore bowed his head. A fair covenant. A deep, resonant horn blared across the horizon, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. The officer stiffened. "They're beginning the march." The Inquisitor turned toward the sealed doors, her eyes burning with grim determination. "Then our council ends," she said. "The time for words is over." Dumbledore lifted his wand as the first distant roar of chaos split the sky. The storm was coming, and he would meet it. The horns of chaos rolled across the ash-choked plains like the bellow of some ancient titan, each note a promise of ruin. The cathedral shook beneath the pressure of the gathering horde, dust drifting from the cracked ceiling as though the very bones of the structure trembled in dread. Dumbledore walked beside the Inquisitor toward the great doors, each step measured, every sense sharpened by the lingering presence he had felt since his fall through the Imperium. It hovered at the edges of perception, like a half-remembered dream, watching, whispering, bending the air around him in patterns that made the very stones uneasy. The Inquisitor paused before the barricades. "Open them," she commanded. The guards hesitated, then obeyed. The doors groaned open, releasing a gust of cold night air laced with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. Outside, St. Corvin's Gate loomed, a vast fortress wall stretching across the horizon, its battlements manned by exhausted soldiers lit by flickering torches. Beyond the wall lay a storm of chaos. Dumbledore stepped forward to the threshold, and for a moment he simply watched. Fires burned in the distance, casting a hellish glow over the landscape. The enemy stretched as far as the eye could see. Cultists waving banners of writhing symbols, twisted mutants lumbering like beasts, and robed sorcerers whose bodies shimmered with warp flame. Their chants rose in discordant crescendos, a language that pierced into thought rather than ear. The Inquisitor's voice lowered to a harsh whisper. "They are preparing a ritual. See how the sorcerers align themselves. They mean to tear open another breach, a far larger one." Dumbledore's gaze narrowed. He sensed it instantly, the swelling pressure in the air, the sickening stir of warp currents coiling like serpents in the dark. These sorcerers acted not merely as summoners but as conduits, puppets amplifying some distant will, a will he recognized. The presence that had followed him from the Imperium unfurled like smoke behind his thoughts, brushing against his mind with cold, curious fingers. He felt a whisper, not spoken, but shaped from intention and shifting fate. "You shine brightly, old one, too brightly to be ignored." Dumbledore's breath stilled. His wand tightened in his grip. The whisper coiled deeper, weaving itself into the thoughts he guarded most fiercely. "You tore through my domain with will alone. You severed what lesser beings cling to for sanity. You are interesting." A ripple of faint azure light shimmered across the horizon, flickering like the wings of a spectral bird. The Chaos Sorcerers raised their staffs in unison, and for a heartbeat, Dumbledore saw a symbol form above them, an eye woven from shifting lines of impossible geometry, the mark of Zinj. A sharp pain lanced across his temple, not physical but spiritual, like a claw scraping across the surface of his soul. Images flashed, corridors twisting into labyrinths, reflections smiling independently of their owners, futures branching into impossible fractals. Threads of possibility spun around him like strands of silk. Dumbledore inhaled, steady but shaken. The Inquisitor noticed the slight tremor in his breath. "What do you sense?" she demanded. He answered without averting his gaze. "The same entity that watched me in the warp now turns its full attention here. The sorcerers beyond that gate are its instruments. They attempt to draw me into its design." Her expression hardened. "Tzeentch seeks to corrupt your mind." "Not corrupt," Dumbledore murmured. "Claim." The word dropped like a stone into cold water. The officer who had joined them paled. "If one of the ruinous powers has marked him..." The Inquisitor shot him a glare. "Speak nothing of it. Fear feeds chaos." But the fear was there in her eyes nonetheless. Another whisper slid through Dumbledore's thoughts, this time clearer, smoother, almost inviting. "You seek order. You seek understanding. I can grant you the knowledge your world never revealed, the truth behind magic, the truth behind everything." Dumbledore's jaw clenched. "Begone." A soft chuckle echoed through his mind, as though the storm itself mocked him. "You cannot deny the current of destiny, old wizard. You swim in a sea I command." The distant sorcerers raised their staffs in unison, and a spear of warp light erupted skyward, tearing a vivid line across the heavens. Soldiers along the battlements shouted warnings. Defensive cannons roared to life. The ground trembled as the ritual intensified. Dumbledore stepped forward, raising his wand to counter the rising corruption. But before he could cast, the presence tightened around him like a snare. Bold, defiant, admirable. A sigil burned into the air before him, visible only for a moment, subtle as breath. A twisting mark, curved like a serpent swallowing its own tail, flickering in hues of deep blue and violet. It hovered, weightless, then dissolved into nothingness. But its impression remained. Dumbledore gasped quietly, so softly that only the Inquisitor noticed. "What happened?" she demanded, stepping closer. His voice was low, strained. "Tzeentch has extended a claim." The Inquisitor froze. "A mark?" "Not complete," Dumbledore said. "Not ownership. A thread. An attempt to bind my fate to his schemes." A priest nearby crossed himself in trembling horror. The officer stepped back, hand hovering near his holster, as though instinct forced him to consider the possibility that the wizard before him might become an enemy at any moment. The Inquisitor's voice, when it came, was a whisper of cold steel. "Can you resist it?" Dumbledore straightened, drawing in a breath that tasted of ash and iron. "I have resisted far darker temptations than knowledge," he said, "but I must sever the thread. If I do not, he will use it to steer my path." The Inquisitor nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then we strike first." A horn blared from St. Corvin's gate, signalling that the enemy's ritual neared completion. Warp light flickered across the sky, and the sorcerers beyond the walls lifted their staffs as the air split with a rising shriek. Dumbledore lifted the Elder Wand. His voice was quiet but resolute. "Then let us begin." The mark of Tzeentch pulsed faintly in the wind, and the first blow of the coming war whispered through the dark. The warp light tearing across the heavens bathed the battlefield in shifting hues of violet and cold cerulean, as though the sky itself had become a living wound. The great walls of St. Corvin's Gate rose before Dumbledore like a fortress carved from the bones of an age-long martyr, its battlements lined with guardsmen clutching weapons whose barrels glowed with overuse. The air hummed with anticipation, thickened by the corruption gathering beyond the outer ridge. The armies of chaos pressed forward in waves, cultists in tattered robes, mutants twisted by unnatural growths, and towering spawn that lumbered on malformed limbs. Above them, the sorcerers channeled their ritual, weaving a lattice of warp energy that pulsed like a malignant heartbeat. Dumbledore moved to the center of the rampart beside the Inquisitor. Her face was set in a mask of iron determination, but even she could not disguise the way her gauntlet tightened around the hilt of her weapon. The officer stood nearby, shouting orders that barely carried over the rising storm of war. The young soldier, who had survived through Dumbledore's healing, watched the horizon with eyes full of fear and fragile hope. A sudden blast of horn calls echoed across the plains as the first wave of cultists surged forward. Their cries rose like the howls of animals freed from cages. Lasfire crackled from the battlements in a relentless volley, cutting down dozens, but still they advanced. Some were consumed by their own mutations before reaching the walls. Others burned with warp fire that defied physical injury. Each step they took shook the earth with pounding devotion to destruction. Dumbledore extended his wand. A ribbon of shimmering light unfurled from its tip, forming a barrier that curved along the upper parapet. Bolts of warp flame hurled from the enemy sorcerers collided with the shield and shattered into harmless sparks that dissipated in the wind. The guardsmen gasped, momentarily stunned by the alien magic that saved their lives. The Inquisitor did not look away. "That thread Tzeentch cast upon you," she said, her voice low. "Is it still there?" Dumbledore felt it, an almost imperceptible tug at the edge of his consciousness, like a strand tied around the soul. It pulled gently, coaxing him toward decisions he had not intended, whispering impossibilities he would never choose. Fate twisted subtly around him. Every time he raised his wand, he sensed the faintest resistance, as though another hand tried to guide the motion. "Yes," he answered, "but it has not rooted deeply. Not yet. Then we must sever it before he strengthens the hold." A roar tore through the battlefield as a second wave approached, larger and more frenzied than the first. Mutants clad in bone armor charged with staggering steps, each one swollen with chaotic energies. Behind them, a chaos champion thundered forward atop a horned beast, wielding a warp-forged halberd that dripped with flames the color of poisoned oceans. His mask bore the twisted sigil of Tzeentch, and his voice carried above the horde like an invocation. "Bring forth the storm soul. The architect wills his joining." Dumbledore lifted his wand, but before he could cast, the warp thread pulsed, subtle, insidious, attempting to alter the shape of his spell. He felt a twist in the magic, a slight distortion aimed to wrench his intent into something more destructive, less controlled. For a moment, he nearly faltered. Then he exhaled, grounding himself in memory. Hogwarts, the warmth of Fawkes's song, the quiet of ancient libraries where wisdom outweighed power. The elder wand steadied. The spell obeyed. A torrent of brilliant white fire erupted from his wand, sweeping across the approaching mutants. Their howls vanished in the roar of purifying flame as their warped flesh disintegrated under the onslaught. The Chaos Champion's mount staggered, screeching in pain. The champion lowered his mask, revealing empty eye sockets filled with swirling blue smoke. His voice bellowed with rage. "The Fate Weaver claims you, wizard." He hurled a javelin of warp matter directly at Dumbledore. The air shrieked as the weapon streaked toward the rampart. Dumbledore flicked his wand, bending the space between them. The javelin curved mid-flight, reversing course and impaling the ground at the champion's feet. The beast reared, slamming its hooves into the earth and crushing several cultists behind it. But the champion did not fall. Tzeentch's favour flowed through him like molten destiny. His halberd ignited in a blaze of shifting symbols. As he raised it, the sorcerers behind him intensified their chant. The sky trembled. Warp energy coiled overhead like a serpent preparing to strike. A priest near Dumbledore whispered in terror, "They are opening the breach." The Inquisitor drew her blade, which glowed with a faint aureate halo. "Wizard, if they succeed, this world ends." Dumbledore nodded, stepping forward to the edge of the battlement. The warp thread tightened, pulling harder now, coaxing him toward a specific choice, urging him to funnel his magic toward the breach in a way that would amplify rather than stop it. A trap woven by a master of manipulation. He resisted, but resistance alone would not suffice. The Chaos Champion roared, charging the gate with impossible speed. The walls shook under the force of his assault. The beast slashed at the stone, its claws leaving trails of warp fire. Dumbledore descended the steps, moving with the swiftness of a man half his age. He reached the base of the gate as the champion struck again, each blow cracking the ancient masonry. The young soldier followed, breath ragged. "Sir, please, let me stand with you." Dumbledore placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your courage honors you, but stay behind me." The champion swung his halberd downward, aiming to cleave Dumbledore in two. The old wizard stepped aside with graceful precision, raising a shimmering ward that deflected the blow and sent a shockwave rippling across the ground. The beast screeched as the magic seared its corrupted hide. The champion snarled, "You resist the architect, futile." "You misunderstand me," Dumbledore replied calmly. "Resistance is necessary, but understanding is essential." He raised the Elder Wand. For a moment, the warp thread shone within his mind, twisting like a hook embedded in thought. Dumbledore grasped it, not to follow it, but to pull. He drew the thread into the center of his awareness, isolating its influence. The Chaos Champion charged with a roar. Dumbledore whispered, "Finite." The spell detonated in a surge of golden-blue brilliance, not outward, but inward, shredding the warp thread entwined around his consciousness. The psychic link to Tzeentch screamed, buckled, and snapped. The champion halted mid-charge, staggering backward as if struck by an invisible hammer. The ritual faltered. The sky's wound flickered. Cultists cried out, their chants breaking. Dumbledore exhaled slowly. The pressure vanished. His mind cleared. The Inquisitor stared from atop the wall, her voice incredulous. "You severed a thread cast by a Chaos God." Dumbledore did not answer. His eyes remained locked on the champion. The beast collapsed beneath the armored figure, and the champion rose unsteadily, warp flames flickering weakly around him. For the first time, uncertainty crackled in his void-filled eyes. Dumbledore lifted his wand. The champion roared in defiance, and the air between them burned with the opening spark of the true battle for St. Corvin's Gate. The Chaos Champion steadied himself, jagged breaths rattling through the hollow of his mask as he raised his halberd once more. The beast beneath him twitched, dissolved into a puddle of warp flesh, and evaporated in a hiss of shimmering smoke. All along the battlefield, the sorcerers faltered in their chanting. The thread to Tzeentch severed, the ritual quivered like a wounded animal. Yet the storm did not break, only recoiled, gathering strength with renewed malice. Dumbledore faced the champion alone at the base of St. Corvin's Gate. The old wizard silhouette stood framed by the burning sky. Wand held steady, robes whipping in the rising wind. The champion spread his arms wide, as if embracing the madness swirling around him. "You refuse destiny," he growled, voice layered with the crackling distortion of the warp. "But fate is a river that cannot be diverted." Dumbledore shook his head. "Destiny bends for those who understand it." The champion lunged. His halberd carved an arc of sickly blue flame, each stroke tearing rents in reality as it passed. Dumbledore dodged the first blow, shielded the second, and countered with a blast of pure light that struck the champion's armor like a meteor. The shock sent ripples across the battlefield, knocking cultists backward and forcing guardsmen to brace against the battlements. But the champion did not fall. He drove forward, strength multiplied by the ruinous power that clung to him like molten chains. His halberd struck Dumbledore's ward with a detonation that cracked the stone beneath their feet. Dumbledore slid backward, boots scraping, breath tight. The strain of deflecting such brute force weighed heavily against him. Above them, the ritual flared back to life. The sorcerers chanted again, louder and faster, warping the air with each uttered syllable. Warp tendrils snaked down from the blackened sky, reaching greedily toward the battlefield. The Inquisitor shouted orders across the ramparts. "Break their line. Target. The sorcerers." Lasfire erupted in disciplined volleys, painting the night with streaks of red. Dozens of cultists fell, but the sorcerers were shielded by hues of shimmering distortion, protective wards infused with the will of Tzeentch himself. The ritual surged. A tear opened in the sky, a fracture of impossible color. The air trembled. The warp pressed against the veil, hungry, eager to swallow the dying world. Dumbledore sensed the rift growing. If he failed now, the breach would expand beyond control. No magic he possessed could seal it once fully open. The champion struck again. This time, the blow caught Dumbledore's ward at a weakened point. The shield shattered with a sound like breaking crystal. The old wizard was flung backward, crashing into the stone steps. Pain lanced through his ribs. His wand clattered beside him. The champion advanced, halberd crackling with warp fire. "Submit," he hissed. "The changer of ways marked you for a purpose. You will walk the path he has woven." Dumbledore pushed himself to one knee, reaching for his wand. The world blurred for a moment. A ringing filled his ears. The warp thread severed moments earlier still left a faint ache, like a wound not yet closed. The champion raised his halberd for the killing blow. Then a single note echoed across the battlefield, clear, warm, impossibly pure. A phoenix cry. The sound pierced the thick warp miasma, cutting through despair like sunlight through the darkest cloud. The chanting of the sorcerers faltered. The champion hesitated. Guardsmen paused mid-fire, some lowering their rifles in stunned awe. A column of radiant flame burst into existence above Dumbledore, spiraling downward in a graceful arc. Wings spread wide, feathers gleaming with molten gold and crimson. Fawkes descended from the heavens like a comet of hope. He let out another brilliant cry as he landed at Dumbledore's side, the air shimmering with arcs of healing heat. For the first time since Dumbledore's arrival in the 41st Millennium, the warp recoiled, not from force, but from purity. The old wizard rested a hand lightly upon the phoenix's wing. The warmth travelled up his arm, knitting the pain in his ribs, steadying his breath, clearing the fog clouding his thoughts. Fawkes shifted forward, eyes burning with fierce intelligence, his body radiating a light that pushed back the encroaching tendrils of chaos. The champion snarled, "A creature of flame? You dare defy the warp with a bird?" Fawkes answered with a burst of incandescent fire that scorched the ground between them, forcing the champion to leap back or be consumed. Dumbledore rose fully now, the Elder Wand glowing once again, fueled not by desperation, but by renewed clarity. "This is no ordinary flame," he said quietly. "This is rebirth, renewal, purity untainted." Fawkes beat his wings, and the resulting gust swept outward, dispersing lesser demons attempting to claw free from the forming rupture. Above, the sorcerers wailed as their ritual's integrity faltered. Several staggered under the intensity of the Phoenix's radiance, their protective wards burning away like frost under sunlight. The champion roared in fury. "You cannot undo fate." "Fate is not a cage," Dumbledore replied. "It is a canvas." He raised his wand. Fawkes soared upward, weaving through the air with streaks of golden flame trailing behind him. The Phoenix circled the rift, each pass leaving a trail of pure light that clashed violently with the warp tendrils pushing through. The sky shrieked. The breach convulsed. The sorcerers convulsed with it, their bodies twisting as the backlash of their interrupted ritual tore through them. Bolts of uncontrolled warp energy exploded across the battlefield, disintegrating cultists and mutating others into grotesque forms before they collapsed. The champion charged one last time. Dumbledore met him head-on, Fawkes' fire coalescing around the Elder Wand. A vortex of golden flame erupted, clashing with the halberd in a burst that shattered reality for a breathless instant. The warp fire died, the halberd cracked, the champion staggered, armor glowing red-hot. Dumbledore pressed forward, his voice rising in a single, commanding word that resonated through the battlefield like a thunderclap. "Begone!" The golden flame erupted, engulfing the champion in a pillar of brilliance. The warped armor split, the mask shattered. A scream ripped through the night, distorted, unraveling, then faded into silence. When the fire dimmed, nothing remained of him but a patch of scorched earth. Above, Fawkes gave one final cry before landing beside Dumbledore, wings folding as the battlefield fell into stunned quiet. The breach trembled, shrinking, but not yet closed. The Inquisitor looked down from the rampart, awe and calculation mixing in her eyes. "Your Phoenix. It is a weapon against the warp." "No," Dumbledore said softly, resting a hand atop Fawkes. "He is a guardian against despair." The ground vibrated again, not from chaos, but from the sheer strain of what had just been averted. Soldiers steadied themselves, priests whispered prayers. Dumbledore looked toward the trembling rift above. "Fawkes bought us time," he murmured, "but the storm is not yet broken." And in the flickering light of the dying sky, the warp wound pulsed, waiting, hungering, refusing to close peacefully. The breach trembled overhead like a wounded star pulsing in uneven rhythms as Fawkes' golden fire weakened the sorcerer's ritual. The sky bled with threads of indigo and violent pink, each ripple a reminder that the Imperium crouched just beyond the veil, waiting for its chance to devour the world whole. Dumbledore stood beneath it, with the Elder Wand raised, Fawkes perched upon a fractured pillar beside him, feathers still glowing with residual brilliance. For a brief moment, it seemed the victory might hold, until the air thickened again, and the wind fell unnaturally silent. The Inquisitor sensed it instantly. Her hand gripped her sword hilt, as if the steel alone could anchor her to reality. "Something moves," she murmured. "Not upon the ground, through it." Dumbledore felt it too. A pressure, not physical, but spiritual, pressed against the fabric of thought itself. It slithered past his mental defenses with the gentleness of a lover's whisper, yet held the cold arithmetic of a predator studying prey. The breach above flickered, shrinking for a heartbeat before expanding again, as though inhaling. Then the world around him shifted, not outwardly, inwardly. The battlefield wavered, fading at the edges like a memory slipping from grasp. The voices of guardsmen and the shouts of officers grew distant, stretched thin, echoing through an impossible corridor. Forks called sharply, but the sound muffled, as though Dumbledore had been submerged underwater. He tried to move, tried to ground himself, but the world pivoted and the sky inverted. He blinked. The battlefield was gone. He stood instead in a labyrinth of floating staircases, each one bending into impossible shapes, spiraling into places where no mortal geometry could exist. The stone beneath his feet shimmered between marble and feathers, between ash and glass. Runes shifted across the walls, not carved, but alive, rearranging themselves into new meanings with every blink. The air smelled of ink, parchment, and something acrid, like burning truth. This was no illusion. It was a prison of the warp. A soft voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome, Albus Dumbledore." He tightened his grip on the Elder Wand. "You have no right to summon me." A low, amused laugh rippled through the shifting air. "Summon? Oh no, old wizard. I have merely invited you into a space of understanding." The floating staircases twisted, forming a spiraling arc before him. From within the swirling runes, a silhouette emerged. Tall, robed, shifting constantly. Eyes shaped from swirling galaxies blinked once, then reformed as avian irises, then as twin flames of cerulean fire. Each change was seamless, deliberate. "You have fought well," the presence continued. "You broke my champion. You severed my thread. Few mortals have that strength." "Tsinj," Dumbledore whispered. "Names are chains," the entity replied, its laugh echoing like chimes made of bone. "But Tsinj will suffice, if it comforts you." Dumbledore lifted his wand, sending a torrent of white light toward the figure. The spell struck, but dissolved upon contact with the shifting form, absorbed like a stone cast into a bottomless lake. "Do not struggle," Tsinj said gently. "This is not a duel. This is an opportunity." Dumbledore stepped back, ensuring his stance remained solid. The labyrinth shifted subtly beneath him, as though testing his balance. But he did not fall. "What do you want?" he asked. Tsinj's swirling form leaned closer, though distance meant nothing here. "You are unlike the psychers of this realm. Your magic exists outside our cycle. It is structured, harmonized. You do not chisel power from the warp. You command a different foundation entirely. Imagine what might be achieved if you combined your order with my change." Dumbledore's voice steadied. "Order and chaos do not mix." A soft sigh drifted through the air. "Everything mixes, old wizard. That is the nature of creation. You cling to structure, to rules, to the naive belief that intention alone shapes outcomes. But intentions unravel. Rules are rewritten. Fate is clay." The labyrinth expanded before Dumbledore, revealing paths that branched infinitely, each path showing glimpses of futures he could not fully grasp. A Hogwarts engulfed in purple flame, a golden throne flickering with the last breath of humanity, a phoenix turning black, then dissolving into ash. Another path, a world saved by an old wizard whose power bent the tides of chaos itself. Tsinj's voice coiled gently around his thoughts. "See, Dumbledore, you could change everything. No longer bound by mortal fragility, no longer limited by the weaknesses of your species. Become a conduit of design, not my servant, never that, but my collaborator." Dumbledore shook his head. "You wish to corrupt me." "Corrupt? Tzeentch echoed with amusement. You misunderstand. I do not need to corrupt you. I only need to show you enough futures that the one you choose becomes mine by default. The staircases around them twisted suddenly into a tight funnel, spiraling downward into an abyss of swirling knowledge. Words, millions of them, flew past him like a storm. Spells he had never learned, secrets of the Imperium, truths about his own magic that his world had hidden. You seek understanding, Tzeentch whispered. You always have. Knowledge is your greatest temptation, and I am the well from which knowledge flows. For a moment, just a moment, Dumbledore felt the pull, the hunger, the thirst for answers he had spent a lifetime pursuing. Ariana's final scream, the Elder Wand's true origin, the mechanics of the Phoenix Flame, the nature of immortality, the structure of magic beyond the confines of wizards and witches. He closed his eyes, and instead of reaching outward, he reached inward. The warmth he sought did not come from Tzeentch's seductive flood of futures. It came from something smaller, gentler, the echo of Fawkes's song, a reminder that knowledge without humanity was ash. He opened his eyes. No, he said simply. The labyrinth froze. Tzeentch's shifting mask tilted. No, I will not trade my soul for understanding, Dumbledore said, and I will not allow you to weave me into your design. The warp trembled as though offended. You defy a god. I defy a liar. In an instant, the labyrinth cracked. The runes screamed. Tzeentch's form vaporized into a typhoon of enraged color. Dumbledore held the Elder Wand aloft, anchoring himself with a single focused thought. Fawkes. A burst of golden flame erupted beside him. The phoenix lunged into the warp space, wings blazing. His cry ruptured the illusions, burning through the spellwork Tzeentch had laid. The labyrinth crumbled, collapsing inward. The warp shrieked, and Dumbledore felt the world snap back into place. He stumbled onto the stone steps of St. Corvin's Gate, gasping as Fawkes steadied him with a wing. The Inquisitor rushed toward him, eyes sharp with fear and fury. What happened? She demanded. Dumbledore looked up at the still twisting breach. Tzeentch has shown his hand, he said quietly, and he intends to break this world. The warp wound above them pulsed once more, and this time it began to open. The breach above St. Corvin's Gate yawned wider, its edges crackling with unstable warp light that bled into the sky like a living wound. Every heartbeat fed the growing distortion. The air vibrated with a low, resonant hum, as though reality itself strained under the pressure of forces trying to force their way into the material realm. Dumbledore steadied himself against Fawkes's warm flank, breath still ragged from Tzeentch's psychic assault. Yet he forced his gaze upward, refusing to look away from the threat swelling above. The Inquisitor approached swiftly, boots striking the stone with sharp finality. "What did he show you?" she demanded. "What did the Changer of Ways attempt?" Dumbledore shook his head slowly, recovering enough clarity to speak. Not temptation of power, temptation of purpose. Tzeentch wished to rewrite my intentions, to turn curiosity into hunger, to make me follow the path he crafted. "Then he fears you," she said sharply. "Or he seeks to own me," Dumbledore replied. The breach spasmed, releasing a cascade of crackling energy that scorched the battlements. Guardsmen ducked, several thrown back by the blast. A few screamed as warp tendrils brushed them, dissolving flesh into shimmering dust. The priests along the wall shouted litanies, their words trembling under the oppressive presence radiating from the sky. The officer near the Inquisitor tightened his grip on his rifle. "At this rate, the entire valley will be swallowed." "No," the Inquisitor murmured. The entire world. A sudden shift in the wind carried a metallic scent. Ozone mingled with incense, heavy and ancient. Dumbledore felt a tingle, as though a presence brushed past the edges of his perception. Not malignant, not warp-born. Something older, something disciplined. From the highest ridge of the battlements, a figure stepped into the dying light. He moved with the stillness of a statue and the purpose of a blade unsheathed. His golden armor, engraved with patterns older than any cathedral, reflected the unstable sky in muted hues. Every plate of the suit fit seamlessly, each etched mark carrying the weight of a forgotten oath. A long, elegant spear rested in his hand, its haft inlaid with symbols that shimmered like faint starlight. His helmet, fashioned in an avian motif, turned slowly toward Dumbledore. The air around him shifted as though acknowledging his presence, a custodian. Even the Inquisitor stiffened at the sight. Her voice barely rose to a whisper. "The Legio Custodes, here." The officer took an involuntary step back, bowing his head. Priests dropped to their knees. The guardsmen, battle-worn and trembling, stared with awe. Custodians did not leave terror without reason. Dumbledore met the stranger's gaze and felt something indescribable, like standing before the heartbeat of a civilization, silent yet immense. The custodian descended the battlement steps without sound, each movement fluid despite the immense weight of his armor. He stopped a few paces away, his spear angled downward in a gesture neither hostile nor welcoming. The Inquisitor found her voice. "By whose authority do you stand upon this world?" The custodian's reply was quiet, but carried through the chaos with impeccable precision. "By authority of the throne." A ripple of reverence moved through the cathedral ruins. He turned his attention to Dumbledore. "You are the anomaly." Dumbledore inclined his head. "An outsider, yes, but one who seeks only to prevent catastrophe." "You resisted a direct influence of Tzeentch," the custodian said. "Few mortals withstand that trial unbroken." His gaze sharpened. "Interest in you grows." Dumbledore sensed the unspoken meaning. The Emperor knew of him, perhaps even watched him. The custodian continued. "The Master of Mankind perceives disturbances that ripple through the warp. Your arrival has not gone unnoticed." The Inquisitor stepped between them, as if shielding the custodian from danger, or perhaps shielding Dumbledore from scrutiny. "This world stands at the brink. Whatever judgments you carry, they must wait until we close the breach." The custodian seemed to consider her words, then shifted his stance slightly. "You misunderstand." He pointed his spear toward the breach. "I did not come to judge. I came to observe." The word struck Dumbledore with more weight than any spell. Observe. The Emperor watched the wizard from afar through a guardian whose sight rivaled prophecy. But why? Was it curiosity? Fear of a new psychic force he could not control? Or something akin to hope? Before he could ask, the sky screamed. The breach tore open further, as if enraged by the custodian's presence. A vortex of swirling, clawed darkness erupted outward, stretching toward the battlefield like an immense, taloned hand. Mutants and cultists cheered wildly, some throwing themselves into the churning light only to be shredded into streams of essence. The Inquisitor snapped her attention to Dumbledore. "Wizard, now!" Dumbledore lifted the Elder Wand, feeling forks surge upward with a blaze of renewed fire. The phoenix spiraled into the sky again, golden light trailing behind him like a comet's tail. His flame struck the outer edges of the vortex, pushing back its tendrils by sheer purity, but the breach resisted. Tzeentch's will pushed back harder. The custodian stepped forward, planting the haft of his spear onto the stone. A radiant pulse emanated from the weapon, golden, silent, absolute, like a heartbeat from the throne itself. The warp light shuddered, buckling under the weight of something immeasurably powerful. Dumbledore felt the echo of that pulse vibrate through his bones. It steadied him. Fawkes's flame intensified. The Inquisitor raised her sword, its halo expanding. "Seal it!" The breach shrieked in fury. Warp energy exploded outward, sweeping across the rampart. Guardsmen were thrown back like leaves. Priests clung to shattered stone. Even the Inquisitor winced under the psychic pressure. Dumbledore raised both hands now, wand in one, the other open as if grasping invisible currents. He pulled, not from the warp, but from the raw structure of reality around him. The ground, the air, the light itself. He guided Fawkes's flame, weaving it into a lattice that strained against the breach like a net of brilliance. Tzeentch whispered in his mind again, angry now, stripped of elegance. "You cannot stop me. Fate bends. You bend with it." Dumbledore gritted his teeth. "Not today." The breach convulsed. Fawkes dove, wings flaring. The custodian's spear blazed with the silent echo of the Emperor's will. The Inquisitor screamed a litany, raising her blade high. The combined force struck the vortex. Light consumed the sky. Warp energy recoiled like a wounded serpent. The breach collapsed inward, spiraling into a pinprick of distorted brilliance, then vanished with a thunderous implosion that rattled the bones of the world. Silence followed. Thick, astonished, impossible silence. Fawkes landed beside Dumbledore, exhausted but triumphant. The soldiers on the wall stared at the sky in disbelief. The Inquisitor lowered her blade slowly, chest heaving. Only the custodian remained perfectly still, watching Dumbledore with unreadable intensity. At last, he spoke. "The Emperor has seen your strength. He will decide what role you play in the war to come." Dumbledore swallowed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And what role is that?" The custodian tilted his helm, answering in a tone that was not threat, but prophecy. One that may save the Imperium, or destroy it. Before Dumbledore could respond, the ground trembled with distant thunder. Chaos was not finished. The thunder rolling across the plains did not come from artillery or marching feet. It was deeper, older, like the heartbeat of the warp itself, shaking the world in resentment. The breach had been forced closed, but the echo of its collapse lingered, vibrating through the stones of St. Corvin's Gate and whispering in the minds of all who stood upon it. Dumbledore felt the tremor not only beneath his feet, but within his thoughts, as if the Immaterium had not fully released its grip on him. Fawkes shifted uneasily on the battlement beside him, feathers dimmed, flame muted by exhaustion. The Inquisitor examined the horizon through narrowed eyes, refusing to lower her guard even for a moment. The custodian stood motionless, spear planted into the stone, gaze fixed on Dumbledore as though reading the movements of his soul. Behind them, the guardsmen tended to the wounded in silence, their awe at the victory overshadowed by dread of what might follow. Another ripple of psychic energy slid through Dumbledore's thoughts, cold as a knife drawn across his awareness. He steadied himself, tightening his grip on the Elder Wand. The sensation was subtle at first, like a faint pull from somewhere far away, but it grew steadily until it pressed against him with a familiar, unwelcome presence. Tzeentch was not finished. The Inquisitor stepped closer, her expression sharpened by suspicion. "You felt that," she said. "Do not deny it." Dumbledore exhaled slowly. "He's attempting another approach." She frowned. A psychic invasion. Not quite, Dumbledore replied, voice strained. More like a resonance. A seed he planted before I severed the thread. The custodian's armor glinted faintly in the fading light. Chaos does not retreat. It adapts, and the architect adapts most swiftly of all. Dumbledore felt the pressure again, an ache behind his thoughts, a whisper beneath reason, like a suggestion drifting at the edge of consciousness. His surroundings blurred for a heartbeat. The wall beneath him flickered. The faces of soldiers distorted, replaced by masks of swirling ink. Fawkes's cry rang distant, muffled. The Inquisitor's voice stretched into unnatural echoes. He blinked hard, and the illusion lifted. The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed further. You are compromised. Dumbledore shook his head. Not compromised. Targeted. That distinction means little if he gains ground, she said sharply. The custodian stepped forward. The Emperor perceives the ripples surrounding your presence. You must hold firm, wizard. Chaos infiltrates the mind through doubt. Dumbledore felt the pressure deepen, now more insistent, threading through memories he had buried long ago. Ariana's trembling hands. Grindelwald's triumphant grin. The night he left Harry upon the doorstep, questioning whether it was truly the right path. Zinch plucked at these memories like strings of a harp, letting their tremors echo through his psyche. A whisper slithered through his thoughts, seductive and cold. You resist me, old wizard, but your soul is heavy with regret. Let me ease its burden. Let me rewrite the truths that chain you. Dumbledore closed his eyes, grounding himself. A mind is not a tome to be rewritten at another's whim. The whisper softened, turning coaxing. All minds are tomes. Some merely require the will to revise them. The battlements flickered again, brighter this time. The sky inverted. For an instant, Dumbledore stood not in the war-torn valley, but back at Hogwarts. The great hall glowed with warm candlelight. Students laughed. The enchanted ceiling shimmered with stars. It was peaceful, familiar, and completely false. He opened his eyes to the true world, breath unsteady. He is probing deeper. The Inquisitor's jaw tightened. Then fight. You underestimate the subtlety of such an assault, Dumbledore said. This is not a blow to deflect. It is a suggestion to unravel. Zinch pressed harder now, weaving illusions so swiftly that their edges overlapped. Hogwarts collapsing into ash, children crying out as shadows devoured them, the Elder Wand shattering in his hand. Each vision lasted only seconds before dissolving, replaced by another. The pressure behind them strained his composure. Fawkes suddenly launched into the air, wings blazing. The Phoenix circled Dumbledore, leaving arcs of golden light that pushed back the illusions like fire dispels fog. His song rose, clear and piercing, anchoring Dumbledore's fading focus. The custodian watched closely. Your familiar recognizes the intrusion? Phoenixes see truth, Dumbledore whispered, even when mortals falter. But Zinch's whispers grew more insistent. Why struggle? The Imperium will break. Your world is gone. The warp is eternal. Join me, and I will give you what your universe denied. Perfect understanding. The ground beneath Dumbledore's feet shifted again, rippling like water. He saw the custodian's golden armor corrode, the Inquisitor's face twist into a mask of despair. Fawkes melt into wax before his eyes. He staggered. His wand trembled. The Inquisitor reached for him instinctively, but the custodian raised a hand, stopping her. Do not interfere, the Golden Warrior said quietly. This battle is his alone. Dumbledore sank to one knee as Zinch's illusions swarmed around his mind. Visions of failure, temptation, infinite futures collapsing upon one another. Each image carried the weight of possibility, of paths not taken, of choices that might have birthed better worlds. Thousands of them, millions. The sheer volume threatened to drown him. His breath faltered, his grip loosened, and for the first time since he had arrived in this universe, Dumbledore felt something close to fear, not of death, but of losing himself. Tzeentch sensed it instantly. Yes, yield. Knowledge without sorrow, power without restraint, purpose without guilt. Let me. A single note cut through the invasion like a sword through smoke. Fawkes cried again, louder, brighter, filled with fire that refused to be extinguished. His wings ignited in a pillar of golden flame that cascaded over Dumbledore like a purifying tide. The illusions shrieked and recoiled. The whispers faltered. The swirling futures shattered into ash. Dumbledore lifted his head, eyes burning with renewed clarity. "You cannot rewrite a soul rooted in love," he said softly. He rose to his feet, strengthened by the Phoenix's fire. The warp recoil tore through his thoughts with a scream of frustration, then vanished. The pressure faded. The illusions dissolved entirely. Silence reclaimed the battlements. Dumbledore breathed slowly, deeply, grounding himself in the real world, the stone beneath him, Fawkes's warmth, the distant hum of Imperial machinery, the quiet, wary presence of the custodian. The Inquisitor let out a breath she had held far too long. "Is it done?" "For now," Dumbledore replied. "But he will try again." The custodian inclined his head. "Your resilience is noted." Dumbledore's gaze drifted toward the distant horizon, where chaos gathered once more. "This war," he murmured, "is not fought only with armies." "No," the custodian replied. "It is fought in the soul." And somewhere beyond the veil, Tzeentch whispered in fury. The wind that followed the psychic storm was unnaturally cold, carrying flecks of ash that drifted through the air like snow from a dying world. Dumbledore steadied himself on the battlements, the remnants of Tzeentch's assault still lingering like faint scars across the surface of his thoughts. Fawkes perched upon his shoulder, feathers dimmed but warm, a quiet hum of strength radiating from his core. The soldiers nearby whispered prayers, unsure whether they had just witnessed salvation or the prelude to further damnation. The Inquisitor lowered her blade, though her knuckles remained white around the hilt. "Your mind is your battlefield," she said, her tone edged with something she had not shown before, concern. "If he strikes again, you may not withstand." Dumbledore raised a hand gently. "Fear is what he wants from you." "It is not fear," she snapped. "It is calculation, and calculation demands we prepare for what comes next." The custodian remained silent, his presence a still point amid the ruined ramparts. Only the faint shimmer of psychic nullfield radiating from his armor showed. He remained alert. His gaze followed the horizon, where new fires flickered along the broken ridges. Chaos had not retreated. They regrouped, gathering strength from their god's rage. The officer approached, breath ragged from running between units. "Inquisitor, the cultists amassing again. Their numbers, we don't know. They seem endless." "They are endless," she murmured. "Chaos births soldiers from despair itself." The officer swallowed hard. "Then what hope do we have?" Dumbledore turned toward the ruined plains, wand in hand. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the battlements. "Hope endures where resolve burns brightest." Before the officer could respond, a roar rose from the horizon, a guttural, deafening bellow that rolled across the valley like collapsing mountains. Mutants surged from the smoke in droves, larger and more twisted than before. Their bodies pulsed with living runes, each rune glowing with Tzeentch's unstable colours. The sorcerers behind them renewed their chants, weaving currents of warp energy that crawled across the ground like serpents of light. The Inquisitor drew a breath. They intend to crush the gate through sheer corruption. The custodian stepped forward to the battlement's edge, spear glinting faintly. The Emperor's shadow forbids them from crossing, but our presence alone will not stop this tide. Dumbledore studied the surge of enemies, their madness palpable even from afar. Shadows threaded through their ranks, fractures of reality that bent unnaturally as they passed. If allowed too close, these abominations would tear the gate apart, not through siege, but through erosion of existence. He counted the seconds as they advanced. Their speed increased unnaturally with each step. Fawkes cried out, wings flaring with faint fire. The tug within Dumbledore returned. Not the corruptive whisper of Tzeentch, but something deeper, older. A memory of standing atop the astronomy tower as Death Eaters raged below. A moment when he had embraced fire not as destruction, but as renewal. His magic resonated with Fawkes's call, shaping itself around an instinct that was both ancient and benevolent. The Inquisitor stepped closer, sensing the shift. "What are you intending?" "Something dangerous," Dumbledore said softly, "but necessary." Her jaw tightened. "Wizard, what you wield is not bound by Imperial doctrine. If you unleash something we cannot contain, we will contain it," he said gently, "if we stand together." The first wave of mutants slammed against the outer defences, convulsing the earth. Guardsmen fired in volleys, but the bullets melted upon contact with their warp-saturated bodies. Sorcerers behind the horde hurled flames of purple fire toward the battlements. The custodian deflected the first storm easily with a sweep of his spear, but cracks began to form along the parapets. Dumbledore raised his wand high. Fawkes took flight, singing a rising note that cut through the warp noise like the first dawn-piercing midnight. Golden fire circled him. The Inquisitor stepped back instinctively. "What are you doing?" Dumbledore's eyes glowed faintly. "Purging corruption." He whispered a spell, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and resonant. The words wove around the wand like silk threads of light. Heat bloomed across the battlement, gentle at first, then gathering strength. Fawkes swept overhead, tracing arcs of flame that shimmered like molten sunlight. The custodian's gaze sharpened. This fire is pure. The first wave of golden flame unfurled across the field like a living curtain. It swept outward, expanding in all directions, washing across the mutants and cultists with an almost merciful embrace. Those touched by the fire did not burn. They unraveled, their warp taint dissolving into harmless motes of ash. Screams choked off, not in agony but in surprise, as chaos was stripped from flesh and bone. The fire surged further. Chaos recoiled. The sorcerers shrieked, attempting to counter the spell, but their wards collapsed under the brilliance. Runes on their bodies melted. Their chants faltered. Some tried to flee, but the fire caught them, unravelling their corruption and reducing them to drifting embers. But the flame did not stop. It raced further, devouring the corruption in the ground, burning away filth, igniting the sky with a cleansing glow. For a moment, the battlefield looked as though dawn had broken prematurely. The Inquisitor shielded her eyes. "Enough. You will burn everyone." Dumbledore grimaced as the spell fought him, its reach straining beyond his control. Fawkes circled him frantically, singing louder, applying pressure against the expanding flame with his own will. The custodian stepped forward. "Wizard, rein it back. Balance, not annihilation." Dumbledore lifted both hands, pouring every shred of focus into halting the blaze. It resisted. Pure power always resisted, burning to reclaim all it touched. But he pressed harder, sweat beading on his brow, one trembling as he bent the fire back toward himself. Fawkes dove through the heart of the flame. The fire collapsed inward, shrinking like a dying star, then extinguished in a single brilliant flash. Silence swept across the battlefield. Where chaos had surged moments before, only ash now drifted on the wind. The mutants were gone, the sorcerers eradicated. Even the ground seemed healed, purged of its warp corruption. But the cost had been great. Dumbledore fell to one knee, breath shuddering, wand slipping from his fingers. Fawkes landed beside him, feathers dim but eyes watchful. The Inquisitor rushed forward. "Are you—" "I am fine," he whispered, though fatigue pressed heavily upon him. But the flame nearly overcame me. The custodian regarded him with something like respect. "You wielded power that could sterilize a continent, and you reined it in. Few alive could claim such mastery." The Inquisitor exhaled sharply. "You saved the gate, but a terrible risk." Dumbledore managed a faint smile. The greater the darkness, the brighter the flame needed to drive it back. But even as the soldiers began to cheer, faint tremors rippled through the ground, subtle but unmistakable. Chaos was wounded, not dead, and the fire had not gone unnoticed. The tremors beneath St. Corvin's gate deepened into a low, simmering growl, vibrating through the stone, as though the planet itself strained under the weight of what Dumbledore had unleashed. Guardsmen steadied themselves on the battlements, glancing over the ash-laden plains, where only moments before an army of chaos had roared towards certain victory. Now the valley lay quiet, too quiet, its stillness unnatural, like breath held by a dying world. Dumbledore rose slowly, leaning on the Elder Wand for support. The golden fire had drained him nearly to breaking, leaving his limbs heavy and his heartbeat uneven. Fawkes perched at his shoulder, wings furled, feathers subdued to a gentle ember glow. The Phoenix monitored him closely, radiating strength and concern in equal measure. The Inquisitor stepped near, eyes scanning the horizon with practiced suspicion. "What you purged has not vanished entirely. Something remains beneath the ash, moving." The custodian turned his helm toward the plains. His golden form stood rigid, spear angled downward as if ready to strike at a moment's notice. "The architect will not accept defeat. He sends another instrument." Dumbledore felt it too, a pulse of warp pressure gathering in the distance, like an approaching tide forced through cracks in reality. Though the breach had been sealed earlier, the warp sought new fractures, new weaknesses to exploit. Here, on this shrine world, where faith faltered and fear bloomed, that weakness grew stronger with every passing second. A deep rumble tore across the valley. Ash billowed upward in violent spirals. The earth cracked open in several places, releasing columns of shimmering warp flame. Soldiers stumbled, cursing, clutching at rosaries and sigils. Priests shouted prayers that dissolved into the rising shriek of the wind. Dumbledore's robes whipped violently as he stepped closer to the edge of the battlements. The ground far below bulged as something pushed upward, its shape still hidden beneath the heaving crust. The Inquisitor's voice was sharp. "All units fall back behind the interior barricades, now!" But the officers barely had time to echo the command before the earth ruptured entirely. A blast of warp light speared into the sky, splitting open a fresh wound in reality. A vortex of swirling color churned violently, its textures writhing in ways no mortal eye should endure. and from the heart of that vortex a shape emerged, first a silhouette, then a towering figure of shifting feathers, molten smoke and warped flesh. A lord of change. Tzeentch's chosen champion. Its wings spanned wider than a cathedral roof, each feather a blade of iridescent energy shimmering with malevolent life. Its head morphed continuously, avian beak one moment, a mask of flowing runes the next, then a swirling void where a face should be. Its staff burned with blue fire, and the air around it trembled with prophecy and madness intertwined. Guardsmen collapsed to their knees. Some screamed, others went still with sheer terror. The custodian stepped forward, spear raised. A greater demon. Wizard, brace yourself. The demon's voice rumbled through the air, vibrating the stones beneath Dumbledore's feet. Little flame bearer, it crooned, its voice echoing in countless layered tones. You burn pathways you do not understand. Dumbledore lifted his wand, though his arm trembled. Your master's designs end here. Master. The demon laughed, the sound warping the sky. We are not servants. We are manifestations of his ways, threads of his purpose, and we have come to reclaim what resisted him. Its burning gaze locked on Dumbledore. The ground erupted around the wizard as the demon struck, hurling a torrent of warp flame toward him. Dumbledore conjured a dome of shimmering light, but the impact hammered it with such force that the shield cracked like glass struck by a meteor. He was thrown backward, landing hard against the stone. Forks darted overhead, unleashing a barrage of golden fire that clashed with the demon's sorcery in a shower of sparks. The custodian leapt from the battlement, spear flashing with golden fury. His impact shook the ground, and he launched into a flurry of strikes aimed at the demon's wings and torso. But each blow met shifting flesh that reformed instantly, absorbing the strike like a wave devours a pebble. The demon countered with a sweep of its staff, unleashing a shockwave that flung the custodian across the field. He collided with a shattered pillar, armor denting, but he rose again with implacable resolve. Dumbledore forced himself to stand, gripping the Elder Wand with renewed determination. His mind still carried the scars of Tzeentch's earlier invasion, but he pushed aside the lingering echoes. This was no illusion, no manipulation. This was the final act of defiance, the architect's direct challenge. The demon surged forward, warping the ground behind its steps. Your soul carries threads of destiny unclaimed, it hissed. Threads that we shall weave into prophecy. Dumbledore stepped toward it, seeming impossibly small beside the towering creature. Prophecy is the prison of those who fear choice. The demon descended. Dumbledore thrust his wand upward, unleashing a concentrated spear of white-blue fire that struck the demon's chest. For the first time it recoiled, shrieking in surprise as the magic burned not its flesh, but its essence, anathema to chaos. Yet the demon retaliated instantly, channeling warped futures into a cascade of psychic force that hit Dumbledore like a collapsing star. His knees buckled, vision blurred, blood trickled from his nose. Fawkes shrieked and dove, forming a protective blaze around him. But the demon pressed harder, reality distorted, angles twisted, shadows bent into impossible shapes. Dumbledore felt the edges of his sanity fray as visions poured into him. Shards of futures where he failed, where Fawkes fell, where humanity burned under a sky of endless sorcery. With every image, the demon's laughter deepened. Break, it urged. Break and be remade in the architect's image. Dumbledore's breath came shallow. His heart thundered. He felt himself slipping, but then warmth spread across his chest. Soft at first, gentle, like the memory of a sunrise long forgotten. Fawkes's flame, not burning, cleansing. The phoenix pressed against him, wings enclosing him in a cocoon of golden fire. The illusions cracked, the visions withered, reality steadied, anchored by the bird's unwavering purity. Dumbledore rose anew, eyes blazing with clarity. "I am not yours to reshape." The demon lunged. Dumbledore and Fawkes moved as one. Golden fire and white-blue spellcraft spiraled together, forming a torrent of pure radiance that met the demon's charge head-on. The shockwave shook the valley, ripping ash from the ground and sending fragments of reality spiraling skyward. The demon screamed, not in fury, but in pain. The custodian rejoined the clash, driving his spear into the weakened demon's side. The Inquisitor raised her sword, channeling a beam of concentrated, sanctified energy. The three forces, Phoenix, Custodian, and Wizard, merged into a single, blinding strike. It met the demon at its core. A howl tore across the battlefield. The creature's form split apart, unraveling into streams of violet smoke and fractured prophecy. It collapsed inward, consumed by its own instability, until nothing remained but drifting feathers of light that burned into ash upon touching the air. Silence followed. Crushing, absolute silence. Dumbledore lowered his wand, chest heaving, sweat mixing with dust along his brow. Fawkes perched beside him, exhausted but triumphant. The custodian stood tall, armor scorched but unyielding. The Inquisitor approached, eyes wide with something rarely seen upon her face, astonished reverence. But before she could speak, the air rippled again. A whisper, soft, sinister, not defeated. Tzeentch had many champions. This had been only one. The whisper that lingered after the demon's dissolution crawled across the charred valley like a dying ember carried by poisoned wind. It did not speak in words but impressions, fractured visions, broken futures, hints of threads the architect had not yet relinquished. Dumbledore felt it brush faintly against the edges of his thoughts, probing for cracks left by the battle. But the phoenix's warmth still lingered in him like a shield of living light, and the whisper recoiled, denied its entry. Fawkes fluttered weakly to his shoulder, feathers dimmed to tired embers. Dumbledore laid a hand upon the phoenix's breast. Gratitude, comfort, a shared exhaustion. The custodian stepped forward through the drifting ash, spear in hand, armor scarred from demon fire, yet gleaming with an unbroken calm. The Inquisitor, breathless, approached with eyes alight, not with suspicion, but with a wary respect forged through survival. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the stunned quiet before a revelation. The Inquisitor was the first to break it. "The demon is destroyed," she said, voice steadier than her shaking, hand suggested. "But the warp's echo remains. This world is not yet safe." Dumbledore nodded faintly. "Tzeentch's defeat here will not halt his schemes elsewhere. The warp threads bind all things more tightly than any weave of magic I have encountered." The custodian faced him fully now, towering in his golden armor. "Your presence has disturbed the strands of fate in ways even the Emperor perceives. It is time you journey to Terra." The air shifted around the words, as though reality itself paused to listen. Dumbledore blinked once, slowly. "Terra. The throne world," the custodian confirmed. "Seat of the Imperium, heart of humanity. The Emperor himself has turned his gaze toward you." The Inquisitor stiffened. "If he calls, you must obey." Her voice trembled with something rare, awe mixed with dread. None refused the summons of the Golden Throne. Dumbledore looked across the valley where the corrupted army had once stood. Now only ash remained, swirling in faint vortices that marked where chaos had touched the world too deeply to fully retreat. The stone of St. Corvin's gate still glowed with heat from the purifying fire. The sky was wounded but no longer bleeding. "What would the Emperor want with me?" Dumbledore asked quietly. The custodian tilted his helm, as if measuring the weight of the wizard's doubt. "You have wielded power foreign to the warp and denied one of the ruinous powers when he reached into your soul. You have shaped the fate of this world in ways that defy expectation. The Emperor must know whether you are salvation or threat." The last word hung heavy. Fawkes stirred, feathers warming with a subtle glow as though sensing a crossroads ahead. The Inquisitor sheathed her sword. "You will be escorted under my authority," she said firmly, "until the throne judges your purpose." Dumbledore's gaze drifted toward the broken cathedral, where he had first stood on this world, where fear and awe met him in equal measure. He had fought beside these people. He had seen their suffering, their resilience, their ceaseless struggle against horrors that no human soul should endure. And somewhere beneath their grim resolve, he sensed a flicker of something that had drawn him here perhaps more strongly than any breach in reality: hope. Yet even hope required guidance. "I will go," he said at last. The journey to Terra began at dawn. A skyship, its metallic hull carved with Imperial iconography, descended upon the war-torn shrine world with a thunder of engines. Damaged buildings crumbled under its downdraft. The custodian and the Inquisitor boarded first, then motioned for Dumbledore. Fawkes perched upon his shoulder, wings tucked close. The Phoenix's warmth steadied him, though beneath that warmth lay a growing weariness. The Phoenix had exhausted much of his strength to counter the warp. As the ship rose, the valley shrank beneath them. St. Corvin's gate, a scar of stone and ash upon a wounded world. Dumbledore watched the shimmering horizon, feeling the faintest pull from the Imperium far away, as though the warp itself followed him with burning eyes. The voyage through the void was silent. The custodian spoke only when necessary, his presence a pillar of golden gravity. The Inquisitor studied Dumbledore with an intensity that never waned, her mind racing behind her stern eyes. Hours, perhaps days later, the measure of time blurred in the emptiness. They approached a world unlike any the wizard had imagined. Terra, encased in continent-spanning hive cities, wreathed in defense platforms and radiant with the presence of countless souls. A world of agony and steel and worship. A world that groaned under the weight of the Emperor's unending vigil. The moment the ship pierced the orbital shield, Dumbledore felt him. Not like Tinch, a manipulative, shifting malignance. This presence was vast, still, silent, immeasurable, like a star that had died yet refused collapse. The custodian turned. "You feel him," he observed. Dumbledore nodded slowly. A presence woven through all things, bound and unbound. "Humanity's salvation," the Inquisitor whispered, "and its eternal burden." The ship descended into the heart of the Imperial Palace. Endless towers, watchful spires, a labyrinth of halls carved from gold and bone. When the doors opened, Dumbledore stepped into air thick with incense and a depth of psychic silence that almost deafened him. The custodian led. The Inquisitor followed. Fawkes clung to Dumbledore's shoulder, feathers trembling. At last, they reached a chamber vast enough to eclipse any cathedral he had known. The throne room. The golden light blinded him at first, not merely from torches, but from a radiance that pulsed from the colossal structure at its center. The golden throne, a machine of impossible complexity, a prison, a beacon, a tomb, and upon it sat the withered, shrouded figure of the Emperor of Mankind. Dumbledore felt no voice, no words, no thoughts, only weight. The custodian knelt. The Inquisitor bowed deeply. Dumbledore remained standing, not out of defiance, but because something within him insisted that truth required dignity. Fawkes let out a soft cry, one filled with reverence. In that moment, a warmth touched Dumbledore's mind, not invasive, not forceful, a presence, ancient, distant, focused. He understood then. The Emperor was not asking who he was. He was asking what he would become. Dumbledore bowed his head at last. "I offer what strength I have," he whispered. "Not to rule, not to destroy, but to defend." Silence answered, but silence here was louder than any proclamation. The Inquisitor exhaled shakily, recognizing the exchange for what it was. A vow accepted. The custodian rose. "Then you will serve the Imperium." Dumbledore straightened. "I will stand against chaos wherever it calls." A distant rumble trembled through the palace walls, as though the universe itself shifted. The Emperor's shadow watched, and the war was far from over.